Hey folks, this is JR, I'm a DIY prepper. Welcome to the channel. This past week has seen a lot of developments in several different areas. We've had movement within the U.S. economy, further complications in Ukraine and the Middle East, along with other things like cyber attacks and banking disruptions in different parts of the world. So today we're going to go over these, and as always, my goal isn't to freak people out or make something out of nothing. Instead, I want to help you make sense of what's going on, see what's behind these events, and most importantly, give you real steps that you can take to stay ahead of the curve if things continue to go downhill. First up, we had developments within the U.S. economy, and probably the biggest headline from the past several days has been the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates. This was their first cut in nearly a year, and this was done because of cracks starting to show in the job market. The federal funds rate was lowered by 0.25%, which may seem small, but it can be taken as a sign that the government is concerned about where things are heading. It's also important to understand that this isn't going to be a rapid return to easy money. Inflation is still high, and even though a lot of folks are struggling, the Fed says that they're not ready to open the floodgates and let rates drop dramatically. They're basically walking a tightrope. They're trying to boost the economy without triggering another round of price increases that'll make things that we use every day, like gas and groceries, more expensive. Meanwhile, consumer spending is holding up for the moment. Retail sales were up around 0.6% in August, and that sounds good until you realize that at least some of it was probably because of higher prices at the checkout stand. Folks are still buying stuff, but when they do, it's taking a bigger chunk out of their savings, which for most people isn't that much since the past several years have severely drained what most people used to have in reserve. Overall, job growth is struggling, people are feeling the squeeze, and if inflation doesn't go down, things will continue to get tighter for normal folks over the next few months. Then on top of all that, there's a warning from Ray Dalio, who's one of the most well-respected voices in the financial world. He said this past week that if the Fed cuts rates too quickly or goes back to easy money, it could tank the dollar, spike long-term interest rates, and create the kind of stagflation that we haven't seen since the 1970s. That basically means higher prices, slower growth, and a lot of uncertainty. Dalio also pointed out that America's debt is already well over $37 trillion with no signs of slowing down, and he compared our situation to plaque buildup in arteries. At some point, he says there's a risk of an economic heart attack, and he's giving it 2 to 3 years if we don't get spending under control. Now, what does all this mean for us? First, you may see mortgage rates and credit card rates go down a little bit, which for the short term isn't a bad thing. The real risk is further down the road. If the Fed gets spooked and slashes rates too quickly, we could see the value of the dollar fall and inflation spike back up. All this means that now's a good time to double check your finances. Make sure that you've got some extra cash set aside, and if you haven't started doing so already, look for ways to make your money go further, because it's very unlikely that our politicians are going to tighten their own belts. Next up, we have something that's starting to get a lot more attention, and that's America's power grid. This past week, the Department of Energy announced an initiative that they're calling Speed to Power, which is basically them using emergency powers to keep coal and natural gas plants running and fast-tracking new transmission lines. This is being done out of a genuine fear that the power grid won't be able to keep up with demand, and the reason behind all this comes down to really one thing: data centers. Artificial intelligence, cloud storage, and the 24/7 streaming services that we all dearly love don't just happen in the cloud. They're made possible by massive buildings packed with servers, and some of those facilities can draw more power than entire towns used to. According to some estimates, data centers could be using over 10% of the nation's electricity within the next few years, and that's not counting all the new electric vehicles, heat pumps, and other green tech that people are plugging in more and more every day. The Department of Energy says that we're seeing the first real increase in U.S. electricity demand in about 20 years, and that's pretty scary if you think about it. We've talked about how the grid is aging and stressed out several times on this channel, and now it's being asked to deliver more power than ever, which definitely isn't going to help things. That's why we're starting to hear about speed to power. The government's trying to keep us from basically having our butts handed to us during a big heat wave, cold snap, or a cyber attack. But what's interesting about all this is that a lot of the solutions that they're coming up with are not quick fixes. For example, upgrading transmission lines is going to take years because the US is a really big chunk of land with a bunch of people. And while renewable energy has its place, the reality is that when things get tight, we still rely heavily on fossil fuels to keep the lights on. That actually happened this past summer. A handful of states came close to rolling blackouts, and the only thing that saved them from having to do that was running old coal and gas plants. So, what's the bottom line for folks like us? First, don't be surprised if your electricity bill keeps creeping up. Utilities are already warning that costs for improvements and investments, whether it's data center expansions, battery storage, or hardening the grid, are all going to get passed on to consumers. And while we might not see rolling blackouts tomorrow, the odds are rising, especially in states that are already stretched thin or have retired too many old, more traditional power plants. Then, if you don't have backup power, now would be a very good time to prioritize that. That can mean a traditional fuel-based generator, a solar setup, or even something as simple as a few extra battery banks for your phones and lights if you're on a budget. The government knows that they can't fix this overnight. That's why they're dusting off emergency powers, pushing utilities to build faster, and openly admitting that the grid is at risk. And if we were to experience a major grid down situation, our water utilities would go offline as well. We'd be forced to rely on water we've stored at home ahead of time and our ability to purify additional water as time goes on. Unfortunately, though, in many places, getting clean water from the tap can be a challenge, even when our water treatment facilities are still online. My family and I use our Cove Pure reverse osmosis system daily to make sure that we're drinking the healthiest water possible, and I would like to thank Cove Pure for sponsoring us today. Local water supplies are infamous for having high levels of chemicals and other things that you don't want to put into your body. Those contaminants have been known to cause various health problems, mainly due to long-term and repeated exposure, and that's why I like the Cove Pure reverse osmosis system so much. It's certified to remove up to 99% of biological contaminants like bacteria and viruses, and can also help get rid of heavy metals and chemicals that can cause developmental issues in kids, thyroid disease, and even cancer. Then on top of that, the Cove Pure will also return beneficial minerals like calcium and magnesium to your water and increase its pH to make it more alkaline, which also makes it healthier to drink. Also like how easy the Cove Pure is to use. Just fill up the reservoir and plug it in. The system will then run the water through its filters and keep it ready to go in a pitcher on the side of the machine. You can either select how much water you want to dispense or pour water directly from the pitcher, and it'll also let you pick whether you want your water to be cold or heated up. I use mine several times each day. Then if you know a storm's headed your way, you can purify some extra water ahead of time and store it in separate containers so that it's ready to go when you need it. And if you have a solar power station, you can use that to power the Cove Pure as well. If you want to pick one up for your family, then you can use the URL covepure.com/DIYprepper and get $200 off. I'll also be sure to include that link in the description below. Next up, we have tensions in Europe. Russia's been stepping up its attacks, launching some of the biggest drone and missile barrages that we've seen since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. We're talking about heavy strikes, not just on Ukrainian cities, but right up against NATO's front doorstep. In fact, just in the last few days, there were credible reports of Russian missiles and jets buzzing the borders of NATO countries, specifically Poland and Estonia. And that's significant because every time something crosses into NATO airspace, there's the risk of a shoot down, and that's the kind of incident that could drag the whole alliance, the US included, right into the fight. Poland's already put its military on high alert, and they've made it clear that the next time something crosses their line, they won't hesitate to respond, and Estonia and other Baltic states are saying basically the same thing. NATO as a whole has drawn a bright red line around its territory, and if Russia crosses it, even by accident, the response could be massive. Now, I'm not saying that World War III is going to start next week, but it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see how a situation like this could spiral out of control. Some of history's biggest conflicts didn't start with huge invasions. They started with accidents, misunderstandings, or one side pushing a little too far, thinking the other wouldn't push back. Then on top of all that, the US and its European allies are doubling down on military support for Ukraine. This past week, Washington announced its first major weapons package for Kyiv in months, and it's sort of a lend-lease deal where European allies foot most of the bill and America ships its equipment from its own stockpiles. That means more air defense systems, artillery, and ammunition headed to Ukraine right as they're gearing up for another brutal winter. Then on top of that, EU nations are pledging even more security guarantees, with some countries hinting that they'd step in directly if the war spills over any further. So why does this matter to you and me? First, every time the war in Ukraine escalates, it has a ripple effect. Global food prices can be impacted, Europe's energy market is still shaky, and every time that there's a threat to pipelines or ports, fuel prices could spike overnight, even here in the US. Second, the longer that this drags on, the chances that the US could get pulled deeper into the conflict continue to go up. Now, that may not necessarily mean boots on the ground. It could just mean more money and weapons involved, but it could involve direct confrontation if something really goes sideways near NATO's borders. And then third, the sheer unpredictability of it all is something that we should all take seriously. It doesn't take much, maybe a stray missile, a drone incident, or even a cyber attack on the European power grid to trigger a chain reaction that could impact us back home. If there's one thing that the last few months have taught us, it's that distance doesn't matter as much as it used to. A crisis in Ukraine can hit your bank account, your utility bill, or even your local grocery store a lot faster than you'd think. And with this, keep an eye on what's going on, but don't let it consume you. Make sure your essentials are squared away, double check your backup plans, and don't assume that over there can't affect right here, because if things do escalate, you're going to want to be ahead of the curve, not trying to play catch up. And in any disaster, how you respond to it in the beginning is going to have a big effect on what you look like coming out of it. That's why I came up with the 72-hour survival plan. It shows you what to do now before a disaster happens, along with what to do when things start to go downhill. It's a great course that's already helped a lot of people, and you can get it using the link in the description below. Unfortunately, though, Eastern Europe isn't the only place that's seen tension recently. It should surprise absolutely no one that things are continuing to heat up in the Middle East, and this week it's not just about Israel and Gaza or even Israel and Iran. There's a new potential flashpoint to keep an eye on between Israel and Turkey. Ever since Israel's strike in Doha, Qatar, which targeted Hamas leaders earlier this month, a lot of countries in the region are wondering if they're next on the list. Erdogan made it clear that Turkey won't tolerate Israeli operations against any group, Hamas or otherwise, on Turkish territory. Turkey's government's called Israel's actions state terrorism and accused them of bringing the entire region closer to a wider conflict. And that's a pretty bold statement, especially considering that Turkey is a NATO country and in theory could have the backing of other Western powers if push ever came to shove. But here's where things get even trickier. Some Israeli officials have been very public about their intentions, saying that no place should be safe for Hamas leadership. Not Doha, not Istanbul, not anywhere. So now you have two very powerful countries openly warning each other, and every time that kind of language hits the news cycle, the odds of an accidental or intentional clash do go up. And let's not forget, Turkey sits right at the crossroads of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. If things got hot between Turkey and Israel, it could disrupt everything from regional trade to global energy prices. The Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, oil pipelines, these are all critical supply lines that keep shelves stocked and gas prices relatively stable. A conflict between these two isn't just a local problem. It could have ripple effects that reach all the way over here in the form of higher prices, delayed shipments, or even shortages. From a preparedness standpoint, this is one of those watch very closely situations. If you see rhetoric ramping up, troop movements near borders, or talk of airspace violations between these countries, then those are big warning signs. So what does all this mean for folks here at home? For starters, keep an eye on fuel prices and shipping news. If things go sideways, energy costs and imported goods could take a hit. It's also a good reminder of why having extra essentials on hand is never a bad idea. The bottom line is that Turkey and Israel are two regional heavyweights, and if they collide, the fallout will be felt far beyond the Middle East. You don't need to panic, but you do want to pay attention and have your own house in order just in case this situation escalates. Next up, we have a major cyber attack that hit airline systems across Europe, which left thousands of travelers stranded and caused chaos at airports from London to Berlin. It was a perfect example of how fragile our modern conveniences and infrastructure really are. Hackers pulled off a coordinated ransomware attack that took down the automated check-in systems at some of Europe's busiest airports, and this caused big issues. Airlines were forced to switch over to manual check-ins using iPads, and in some cases literally writing out boarding passes by hand. It was almost like they had to revert back to the 1980s, but, with iPads. But even though airline workers did their best to keep up, the attack still caused big issues. Dozens of flights were canceled or delayed. Passengers were left standing in lines for hours, and airports had to scramble just to keep things moving. Even after several days, some airports still hadn't fully recovered. The attack targeted a major IT provider that supplies check-in systems to multiple airlines, which just goes to show how a single vulnerability can send shockwaves through an entire system. Now, why does this matter for folks like us? It's because these kinds of attacks are not just about inconveniencing people trying to get on airplanes. When hackers hit critical infrastructure, airports, hospitals, utilities, they're showing just how easy it is to disrupt everyday life. And while this week's attack was about money and notoriety, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where the goal is to cause actual physical harm or large-scale chaos. It's a reminder that cyber threats are no longer just a problem for big tech companies or corporations. They're everybody's problem now. If an airport can be brought to its knees by a handful of hackers, it's not much of a stretch to think about what could happen to the power grid, water systems, or even emergency communications. Because of this, we all need to have backup plans. If you're traveling, allow extra time and keep printing copies of your tickets and your IDs just in case. And at home, keep physical copies of important records and have alternative ways to stay in touch with family and friends if systems go down. And as always, don't assume that it couldn't happen here. If Europe can get hit, then so can we. Then finally, we have a story that a lot of people haven't heard about in the US, and that's bank account closures in Vietnam. Even though this happened on the other side of the world, it still holds lessons for all of us here. Over the past week, Vietnam's central bank shut down roughly 86 million bank accounts across the country, basically overnight. And the reason? A new law requiring biometric identification for every account. If your bank account in Vietnam wasn't tied to your fingerprints or facial recognition, it was just frozen or deleted. On paper, the government's calling this a crackdown on fraud and fake accounts. And to be fair, Vietnam, like a lot of other countries, has had real issues with scammers opening accounts under fake names and then using those accounts for everything from money laundering to cybercrime. But the sheer scale of this move is staggering. Like, imagine if here in the US, half the country woke up to find their checking or savings accounts locked down until they went through some brand new biometric process, many of them having to show up in person just to prove who in the world they are. For regular folks in Vietnam, it was a gut punch. People overseas couldn't access their funds. Businesses had payments frozen, and even legitimate account holders found themselves caught up in all the mess. And yeah, there were stories of families scrambling to get money out, folks standing in line for hours at their banks, and more than a few who may never get their money back. So what does this have to do with us? Well, it's a reminder that if your entire financial life is digital and the government or the banks decide to clean house, then there's not a whole lot that you can do about it. Vietnam's not the only country tightening up bank regulations or moving towards cashless biometric verification, which is kind of scary. We've seen versions of this in other places too, especially during financial crises. So be sure that you have options. Diversify your assets, keep some cash on hand, make sure you have access to funds outside of a single system or account, and don't assume that what's yours today is guaranteed tomorrow, especially if you have to rely on somebody else's technology or policies to get to it. Now, if you want to see some of my most used and favorite preps and survival gear, then click here. Or if you want to see cheap household items that everyone should stockpile, then click here. Once again, I'd like to thank Cove Pure for sponsoring us today. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.